Hey everyone, got some tips for anybody that's trying to work rose gold and alloy it themselves rather than buying some grain from a company that sells fine metals. So, a few things I've learned is during the casting process, when you cast an ingot, if you're unfamiliar, an ingot looks something like this, just much less length and it's a lot thicker. And then you put it through a rolling mill to lengthen or withen it. So when you're casting your ingot out of rose gold, maybe this doesn't really apply for your standard 10% silver rose gold, but if you want the pinkest 14 karat rose you can get, you're going to do 6% silver. And for this specific alloy, when you're casting it, it has to cool properly, the initial pour. I really don't know exactly why this happens, but if you cast it in a traditional ingot mold, the ingot every single time comes out brittle and you can't roll it. If you hit it with a hammer, it cracks. So I had a last ditch effort and I was thinking, well, maybe I'll cast a strip in Delft clay, see if that makes a difference. I don't know. I just had a last minute idea to do it, and it worked out phenomenally. So that tells me it has to do with the cooling process of the ingot. Because when you cast in Delft clay, it stays molten for a second or two, and then slowly cools, and then rapidly cools. But with the ingot mold, the almost the second it touches that ingot, it goes to a hardened state and immediately cools. There's no slow cooling from molten to solid. It's instantaneous. And I've tried it with the mold just warmed up, so the metal doesn't splatter all over. I've tried it with it really hot. Neither of those worked at all. But the Delft clay worked really good and I had good results. So when you're annealing this alloy, this 6% rose gold, you there's so many conflicting things online about it. One thing I found is that you definitely do want to quench it when it's red, but like a dark red. You don't want a bright red or a glowing red. It becomes harder at that state when you quench it, and it can sometimes become brittle. You don't want to quench it when it comes down to a black heat because it'll be somewhat annealed, but it won't be as annealed if you do it when it's a dull red. That's pretty much it for this alloy. I got it figured out, and I figured maybe somebody else might be having the same headache and I could save them some stress. So here's the ring. It's one thing I got to tell you about this alloy is if you're buying your pink solder, your rose gold solder from Rio Grande, the hard solder, I don't know if there's something wrong with it, if it's this alloy, but the hard solder melts after this rose gold melts. So the rose gold will melt before the hard solder melts, and I don't really understand that because that's not the concept of solder. That's not what it's supposed to do. The medium solder is very finicky. It's literally just a few degrees below the melt point of the rose gold. So the medium solder works. It's, like I said, very finicky. And this alloy, I think because of the copper content, it is extremely dirty. So you have to have an extraordinary amount of flux everywhere that you want the solder to flow, and your solder has to be fluxed very well. And maybe it's just rose gold, but the medium solder doesn't flow well either. It kind of likes to ball up. I mean, it'll flow, but there's always a big chunk of it left over. With silver solder, I don't ever have that issue. Neither do I with yellow gold solder. But you need to have all the oxidation cleaned off your piece. If you've had it in the pickle and it's removed the copper from the surface, you got to get down to the rose gold and make sure that that's pristine. And the trickiest part is doing multiple joins, because once you have two pieces of metal contacting each other and you don't want them to move, but you have the same issue on the opposite side, so like say this side and this side, if the contact between the two pieces of rose gold get dirty, you're not going to be able to clean it, and it's going to make soldering a nightmare. This metal, it at the slightest bit of heat, it just turns dark. And I'm fairly confident that's the copper content. It's so hard to work with. I don't know how else to explain it. I love the way it files. I love the way it saws. I love the way it looks. I hate the way it works, and I hate working with it. I got it figured out now, though, so I'm not going to have, 2 days of a headache trying to figure out how to get an ingot casted. Honestly, it was throwing me a curveball because it just didn't make sense. I've never had that issue with fine silver, sterling silver, or yellow gold. That issue has never come up where an ingot always comes out brittle, but it has to have something to do with the cooling, because like I said, when I did it in Delft clay, it worked perfectly fine. And I did a big ingot, and I did a small ingot, and I did an even smaller ingot, and all of them turned out the same consistency. They were very workable at that point. I could roll this more than I could roll silver, sterling silver, before it would start to crack. I did have some issues though when I heated it because of the melt point. I got some divots here, but when it's polished, you're really not going to see that. And the heartbeat, I could not for the life of me get that to solder on. It's kind of wedged in there. I mean, it'll move a little bit, but this is going to be inlaid with some turquoise, so it'll have epoxy holding it in. Anyways, guys, hope maybe that you learned something from this video. Maybe I saved you a headache. God bless you.